And last meeting we talked about a particular incident in his life. Today I'd like to take you through as much of his life that I know about, and it's quite extensive, and there's a lot of firsts, a lot of things he became involved in, and it proved that he was above average in many, many ways. He was born in Adelaide. A lot of the pioneers, when we think about the pioneers of Western Australia, came from over east. Norman Brearley, up there, born in Victoria. Horrie Miller, born in South Australia. Jimmy Woods, born in Scotland. And of course, Tom Saggers is not here today, and sent his apologies, but he normally has a very good book here on the life of Charlie Snook. He was born in North Fremantle. So Harry started his working life in the motor trade in Perth, and took it seriously and tried to learn as much as he could about motor vehicles at every opportunity. As has been mentioned by Brian Floyd, he was mixed up in motorcycle racing. In 1922, his mother gave him a hand to buy his first motorbike. Between 1924 and 1927, he got his name in the paper many, many times for his performances, which were outstanding. He first got his name in the paper with the racing that took place at Lake Perkalilly. Lake Perkalilly was 35 kilometres northeast of Kalgoorlie, and the local people started racing there in 1914, and it went on until World War II, and then it came back after that, and they just had their celebrations last couple of weeks ago. So in October, just gone, they celebrated their centenary, and there are some of the early motorcycle riders of the day. And if you remember back to the talk on the Kalgoorlie biplane, the group that got that going was a group of Kalgoorlie motorcyclists. And the information I've read about Lake Perkalilly tells me that quite a number, 5 or 6 of these young men here, were at that first meeting at Lake Perkalilly. So that's a bit of history on the lake. Harry had his first success there in 1924 when he performed with a team, a relay team. Kirkby, Lapham and Baker. They won the 4-mile relay race. There's the result from the newspaper. And they went back in 1925. And Harry won first place in the 6-mile handicap. He also ran second in the state championships, which wasn't bad for a young bloke who'd just taken up the sport. Mind you, he was mixed up in speedway as well by this time. So there's the result out of the newspaper again. That's Harry on the left, and a bloke called John Moyle on the right. John Moyle was a state champion before Harry Baker. So there's the two of them again. 1926, Harry decided that he needed to get a little bit further up the list, so he bought himself a Brough Superior, 1000 cc's. The factory in England guaranteed that the motorbike would do 100 miles an hour, and so Harry was going to make this motorcycle perform, and he did. So in 1926, he won the 8-mile handicap on his 350 AJS. I used to have a 350 AJS. And he won the 10-mile state championship on the Brough Superior. He was the first man to achieve 100 miles an hour in a vehicle in Western Australia. So that got his name up in lights. Also, he picked up the name of Cannonball Baker. There was an American, Irwin Baker. Irwin was employed by the Indian Motorcycle Company, and they paid him on results. If he broke a record, he got paid. If he he didn't break a record, then he didn't get paid. So he toured the world looking for records to break. And he raced the Cannonball Express, a train across America, driven by Casey Jones. Everyone's heard of Casey Jones, haven't they? So he competed with the Cannonball Express, and Irwin Baker became known as Cannonball Baker. He came to Australia a number of years later, and soon after that, Horrie Baker was performing on his motorbike, and of course Baker, Cannonball Baker, they went together pretty well, and that's where Horrie Baker got his name from, Cannonball Baker. Horrie Baker, a couple of years before, in about 1925, had gone to the Claremont Speedway as a spectator. And some of the officials came to him and said, listen, we're short of starters, do you want to have a run? He said, yeah, I'll have a go. So he got his bike out, put on a bit of gear, and won the heat. So they said, well, you know, you better compete in the final. So he competed in the final and ran second without any previous experience. And so he got his name in the paper again. In 1927, they instituted an award called the Silver Gauntlet. And Horrie won the inaugural Silver Gauntlet. And that was very much the prize that was looked towards highly in those early days. But there was a cash component that came with the prize, £20, the size of an amount, probably 6-8 weeks' salary. So what did he do with the £20? Ah, no, he went flying. He went out to see this man here at Maylands Aerodrome. And he took his first flying lesson on the 17th of May 1927 at Perth Flying School, run by Norman Brearley. His instructor was probably Stan Brearley, who was very active in the instruction of pilots in those days. Stan Brearley's already been mentioned by Brian Floyd today. So his first lesson in May, and his first solo in June. He got his A licence, which is equivalent to the private licence, in July, and a couple of months later he was putting on masterful aerobatic displays. In 1928 he studied for and gained a ground engineer's licence, B, I think it was engines. There were others that he studied for and obtained, C and D, in the following years. And I think they were airframes and rigging and that sort of thing. So as well as a pilot, he became a bit of an expert on the servicing of aircraft. He took on a part-time job teaching at Perth Technical College. And being a high-profile person, he attracted lots of students. He formed an association with a man called Herman Ittershagen, who had a wickerworks factory in Shenton Park, but he also got the agency for Land's Bulldog tractors and the agency for the Clem L25 monoplane. Ittershagen was keen to extend his business, and he offered Horrie Beck some work flying the Clem. The idea was that he would set up a flying serviceman to take spare parts to farmers who were using the Land's Bulldog tractor. If anyone showed an interest in the Land's Bulldog tractor, Horrie would go out, pick them up and fly them into a block of land which Ittershagen had developed and demonstrate the capabilities of the tractor. And so to do this, Ittershagen leased 66 acres from the University of Western Australia, and he established what was called the West Subiaco Aerodrome. The land was cleared by a Land's Bulldog tractor, no doubt, and access was from the Nicholson Road subway in Shenton Park down there. If you drive past the Dogs Refuge, you're probably going past this road that was leading out to the aerodrome. This gives you an idea of what it was like. And years later, Idishagen put a racetrack around it, which was called Brooklands Racetrack. Stepping up a few years, there's the Empire Games Stadium. There's McGilvray Oval. Ask Malcolm Yeo about that. That's the location of the Brooklands Racetrack. That's what it's like today. CSIRO here, not Matthews, just the basketball centre there. That's the new athletic stadium there, Superdrome, and of course McGilvray Oval here. Idishagen built a hangar down in this corner, and you'll see evidence of that later on. That's a photo of the last remaining bit of the racetrack that I took in 2011, and I took the photo from that location there. I parked here before this was built. I walked through the bush to that spot. So that was all that was left of the Brooklands racetrack in 2011. Going back to Harry, he flew the Clem on its maiden flight in August 1929 off the West Subiaco aerodrome. Idishagen was very keen on advertising his business, and so he got Harry to take the Clem to the eastern states and fly in the 1929 centenary of Western Australia air race. And so there were about 17 aircraft that eventually took place in the race. That's Harry at the start, doing a compass swing, which is mandatory. That's Harry there. And the race crossed Australia like so. There were a few disasters en route. One of them was a disaster for Harry because by the time he got to Nil here, the weather, they delayed the start for a day because the weather was so bad, but they started the next day an hour late. And of course Harry was battling it in the slowest aircraft. It had a 40 horsepower engine, and it only cruised flat out at 80 miles an hour, not knots, 80 miles an hour, and put a 20 knot wind on it, and you almost have it stationary. Anyway, he got there late, they changed the rules, and he was disqualified from the main event. So he was able to complete the course, and he was eligible for section prizes, but he was ruled out of the overall prize. So that's them at the start. John Hodge, Jack Hodge was his name, and this is the finish. They finished over Perth Oval and then landed at Baylands. Idishagen did a lot of work to promote his business, and he relied on Harry very, very much to keep that business going. Here we've got the Bulldog tractors, the Clem aircraft, and that's him, quite a stately looking figure. He was the honorary German consul. There was a bit of resistance because Germany wasn't a very popular place in the 1930s after World War I. But he soldiered on, and he found Harry Baker to be an adjunct to his business, and Harry found that he could get a lot of hours working for him. In fact, he amassed 200 hours in less than a year flying for Idishagen, and that put him out of the private category and up into the capability of a commercial license. So there's a promotion with Shell at West Subiaco Aerodrome. Field day where Idishagen would demonstrate a tractor. If someone bought it, he would advertise that there'd be a demonstration of the tractor. People would come from miles around to have a look at it. Harry would be there with an aeroplane taking people for joy flights. Let me take you for a flight over your farm. It only cost you $5 pounds. So they made money out of the aircraft in that regard as well. The first of the Clems came with a set of floats. And so these floats were fitted. The aircraft was floated first at Netherlands, and Harry flew it on its first flight in January 1930. That's him putting it to bed after a flight. Quite a nice photograph. It was a magnet for schoolboys because float planes were an absolute rarity in those days. There'd only been about 3 or 4 on the river beforehand from over east and overseas. More than on the river, Baker flew the Clem, ULU, to Mandurah, Bunbury, Albany, and wherever there was water in between to advertise it. They had ideas of starting a service, a flying boat service. It never came to fruition.
Still a 40 horsepower motor?
Yep. Yeah. Imagine getting that off the water.
Yeah. Was that a pub joy?
Pub joy, yep.
He just learned to fly it himself, did he, Brian? Read a book or something?
Who?
Harry.
Oh yeah, just stepped aboard and flew it, yeah, no worries. He was the first man to fly an aeroplane to Rottnest to get it on the ground or water over there. And of course, having flown it to Rottnest, which was about 12 minutes from Netherlands, even at 40 horsepower, it was compared to the Zephyr and the Emerald that used to go over there. It was an hour down the river, then an hour across the ocean to Rottnest. So half your day was gone getting to Rottnest if you left from Perth. So this gave the founding fathers of the Rottnest establishment the idea of building an aerodrome there, and they did. And so the first landing at Rottnest, Harry Baker had planned to do it, and he left Maylands Aerodrome first, and Stan Brearley took off second. Baker flew up to about 5,000 feet to get over the scattered cloud, so that slowed him down a little bit, and with 40 horsepower floats he wasn't travelling too quickly. Stan Brearley took off a couple of minutes later, didn't climb up over the clouds, flew under the clouds and landed there first by a couple of minutes, thereby spoiling Harry's party. Talked about the Brooklands racetrack, just briefly have a look at that. A number of pageants were held, or a few pageants were held there. All sorts of races took place to try and attract attention to motorsport. And if you have an interest in motorsport, the names that featured in the programs here, Aussie Cranston, Melrose, Orb Melrose, those sorts of names all keep on cropping up. And they had aircraft and competing with cars, etc., etc. Harry Baker, of course, would have been performing aerobatics over the top. They had fly-ins to try and attract attention to the outfit. The Aero Club aircraft lined up there. Ideshagen started the Aerial Commerce Company, which he hoped would make money for him. That's the hangar that he built in the southwest corner, and that was his advert for it, Brooklands Airport. Of course, you've got to remember that this is 1930, and they'd come through some pretty tough times with the Depression. Things weren't going so well. Ideshagen had problems, and he really picked the wrong place for his West Subiaco aerodrome. He tried to get government approval to make it a government aerodrome, and the government knocked him back. Harry Baker left him. He was quite upset about that. But you can imagine that Harry Baker had his eyes on bigger things than flying as a serviceman for a small company, which was on shaky ground. Amy Johnson was to fly in, but the weather was bad, so she was driven in by road. And Ideshagen started the Subiaco Flying Club. They had 100 members in a very short time. And I've already mentioned that Baker quickly logged 200 hours, and when the flying school got going, he was logging many more hours. In those days, you didn't need an instructor's license to teach flying. You did if you were teaching flying at an approved government school which was receiving a subsidy. But at a private flying school, you needed no instructional qualification. So Harry was their instructor. Advertising and 100 members. They gave the first hour free. Join our club and you get a free hour's flying. So they came from everywhere to get a free ride in an aeroplane. Harry Baker taught Helen Prosser, who was the first female to obtain a pilot's licence in Western Australia. He also taught Itteshagen to fly. Itteshagen didn't drive. He couldn't handle the clutch in a car, and so he didn't drive. He was driven everywhere by other people. But at the age of 58, he got into an aeroplane and Baker taught him how to fly. I don't know whether he used his licence very much, but he got a licence anyway. I actually went to a meeting at the Brooklands scramble track, and that's what it would have been like in those days. The aerodrome, West Subiaco aerodrome, went into disrepair in about 1935, and of course in 1939 the Royal Australian Air Force went out there with equipment and dug trenches all across it in case some foreign country decided to land an aeroplane on it. So it became a perfect scramble track with all these hollows and bumps and jumps. Okay, that's someone's idea of the track. You and I both know that it was a different shape to that. But the person who drew that probably knew more about motorbikes and cartography. I can say that with authority. Harry Baker purchased a DH-60, which Brian Floyd has already talked about. So learned to fly, Baker Aviation, fly for profit, and it was reasonably successful because he was a go-ahead person. He had a high profile. He started the Meriden Aero Club. He put in a tender for it and got that going. Carried out flying training, as we've mentioned. He went into aerial advertising, leaflet dropping, and he was a master at aerobatic displays. Whenever they talk about his displays, though, people were always very happy with the quality of what they saw. Mr. Anderson, you're here today. You saw some of these demonstrations, didn't you?
Yes, I did, alongside Intershagen in Commander's Trim. And of course, Harry Baker used to put on some wonderful flying aerobatics over the airfield on these wonderful days he had. So it was, I mean, I was riding my bicycle there. I was a kid at the time. So it was, for me, a wonderful introduction to flying.
Thank you for that. From someone who was there. Harry flew the first locally made glider. Other gliders had been flown before, but they were imports. But this one was made by a couple of local people who had a business in Wellington Street. I've forgotten their names. But he was going to be towed. He was going to get airborne by an elastic band. The weather wasn't particularly good, so he got towed up by a truck. What a frightening ride in an aeroplane that had never been flown before. But anyway, he made the flight and survived. One of his star pupils that learned to fly in the DH-60 was Irene Dean Williams, who came from the Goomalling area, a farming family. They had a reasonable amount of money, and she was a star of the show. That's the Aero Club building in the background there, and that's Norman Brearley's establishment over the other side there. that's Irene, Dean Williams. And if you drive into Perth Airport along Fauntleroy Avenue, you pass the Dean Williams building, which is the headquarters of CASA, isn't it? Anyone seen that? Last time I went past Dean Williams building. After she bought the aircraft, she got support from Burley. Financial support, that was, I assume. And of course they couldn't help themselves, they had to go to Lake Perkawilli. And if you look at that, you can see 9 aircraft flew in to the 1931 meeting. This gives you an idea of what Lake Perkawilli was like. They built a grandstand. I think it was a 2-mile circuit track, and they used to get thousands of people there. People would put their vehicles on the train, on trucks to get them there. They'd come from over east to compete. It was a very, very popular arrangement. And of course, Harry was a very popular man when he got there. People would all point at him and say, he's the man with the state championship, first man to do 100 miles an hour, etc. And of course, in those days, they had other races. They had the taxis from Kalgoorlie would go out there and race around the circuit through the traps. They had women's races, and of course, if you extend your memory back far enough, they probably had egg and spoon races and 3-legged races and all that sort of stuff that used to be popular at the time. Harry was offered work at the Aero Club, but decided to maintain his independence. So he didn't say yes immediately, but he gave them a bit of a hand here and there. It was the Australian Aero Club, West Australian section at that stage. But what he did do was fly over east and pick up the Mawson moth. Douglas Mawson had taken a moth to Antarctica, and when it came back to Australia, it was up for sale. The Aero Club put in a tender for it and bought it. Harry went east and picked up the aircraft and flew it back to Western Australia. But while he was in Victoria, he did the RAAF test for an instructor license. So that allowed him to teach at the Australian Aero Club at Maylands, which was subsidised per hour flying and £40 per licence issued. So that's him circled on his return with the Mawson Moth ULD. The gentleman alongside him, elevated, is Cliff Nicholas, who also flew for ANA in later life. So, as I mentioned, Harry had his eyes on bigger things rather than staying with Utershagen, and he flew for WA Airways, initially flying the DH-50 and the DH-66, the Hercules, on the Adelaide run. The lure of Lassiter, we talked about at the last meeting, and we did that to death. Harry had an unfortunate accident in the Astra. Brian Floyd has already said it was one of the worst aeroplanes to ever come out of England. They only ever built 11. Some of them had one engine, or one of them had one engine. A few of them had 2 engines, and one of them even had 3 engines. They sort of just built something and started throwing engines out.
Trying to get it off the ground.
Yes. So there it is at Maylands. And what happened was, as it had happened many times before, the engine failed, but Baker had just taken off from Maylands and was at about 1,500 feet over Belmont when the engine stopped. It didn't wind down, it stopped, clunk. It stopped with such a clunk that the prop disintegrated and flew into the fuselage. He had very little time to establish himself in a glider to a paddock. He got it down, pretty heavy landing. You can see the damage there. The aircraft was written off, never flew again, and everyone cheered. And in a most unusual arrangement, the 9 passengers stepped out, were driven back to Maylands with Harry. 2 hours later, they were in a Hercules with Harry on their way to Adelaide. You couldn't imagine that happening today. 1934, oh sorry, when he joined WA Airways, they said, no, you can't teach at the technical college, we need you 100% of the time. But after a while they relented and said, listen, your courses were so popular that we'd like you to go back to teaching. So he went back to teaching at Perth Technical College. In 1934, Horrie Miller got the Northwest contract, Robinson Miller, and staff from WA Airways started moving in all directions. And Harry was, for a short time, the man in charge of supervising service and maintenance at WA Airways. It wasn't a permanent position, but he filled the gap. In an unusual arrangement in 1935, he gained recognition of his diploma course at Perth Technical College to be recognised by the Civil Aviation Board. People that had passed his diploma only had to do an oral test to obtain the qualification, the federal government qualification. I think that was unique, that no one else in Australia had that right. So they highly respected the course that he ran, supported by other people. So 1936, Norman Brearley sold out WA Airways. The writing was on the wall, it was going downhill. The world situation was changing. And the government weren't very happy with what he'd been doing. He'd been pulling a few strings that worked his way. And he sold it to Adelaide Airways, and Adelaide Airways eventually became part of the ANA conglomerate, Australian National Airways. Harry, with 3 other pilots, was stationed in Perth, with 2 air hostesses. And so the DC-2 from Ghana flew to Adelaide twice a week, with Harry and a co-pilot and a hostess, do the trip over and back, a day off, and then the other crew would fly the aircraft to Adelaide again. He was a stickler for doing things correctly. He had a little notebook in his top pocket. He would comment that the terminal at Ceduna needed sweeping when we got there. The man refueling the aircraft was a little bit slow. We were 3 minutes late in departure because of this happening or that happening. A stickler for things being done exactly right. So World War II came along, and with his background, Brian said that he worked for the Department of Aircraft Production. Well, Harry Baker became the manager of the Department of Aircraft Production because of his knowledge of aviation, engines, airframes, rigging, etc. The books tell us that he created a record by getting 52 people on board a DC-3 aircraft and flew them out of Broome. But what they don't tell you is 50 of them were school children. 2 to a seat and a couple of adults made up the load. But anyway, that's what features, but bear in mind it was full of kids. So that's a photo inside the Department of Aircraft Production, which he managed for a short time. There was an organisation set up which was the DAT, Directorate of Air Transport. Thank you, Alan. And with World War II underway, they were required to move people and equipment to outback places in a hurry, and the Air Force couldn't always manage this. And so what they did was they were calling on private companies to fill in the gap. So this Directorate of Air Transport would say, right, we want this load, it would fit into one of your DC-2s, we'd like the Ghana to go to Darwin and drop some stuff on. So Harry flew secret missions while he was with ANA during World War II. He also wrote a book, and I've got a copy of that at home, and it's quite technical, but you've got to remember it was written about 1938-39. But the content is quite technically oriented. Post-war flying. ANA got the DC-4s, 4-engine, 44-passenger aircraft, to replace the DC-3s. DC-3s were everywhere after World War II, but they got approval to purchase DC-4s, and the first one arrived in February 1946. Harry picked up the second one and flew the Pacific in the Lakrana. So he must have been fairly highly regarded to be in that group of people. It wasn't only him, there were a number of people on the ANA staff who could handle this sort of thing. But he was lucky enough to have his name drawn out of the hat to fly the second one to Australia in March 46, a month after the first one. I'm told that he flew the first DC-4 to Perth. In fact, that's what my father told me, so I believe everything my father told me. And that's outside the hangar at Perth. But some interesting things happened after World War II, 1946 particularly. Harry flew for BCPA, British Commonwealth Pacific Airways. They flew the Pacific between Australia and Canada, Vancouver, Sydney to Vancouver. The Australian government was scared of Pan Am, who were re-establishing themselves on the Pacific. And so they set up BCPA. The Australian government had a 50% share, New Zealand government had a 30% share, the British government had a 20% share. It was set up in such a hurry that they didn't have any real aircraft to operate, so they asked ANA to help. ANA provided 2 DC-4s. The proviso was that the DC-4s went to BCPA when they eventually got on their feet, so 2 years later BCPA got going and the aircraft reverted to them. But while they were flying the Pacific, they were in ANA livery, painted in ANA colours, ANA crews, ANA hostesses. It was an ANA show, and they developed a lot of expertise in overseas transport. They got their fingers into Air Ceylon, and they got their fingers into Cathay Pacific. Of course, this rankled the Australian government because they'd put money into Qantas, and that was their overseas airline. And they were flying between Sydney and Singapore. That was all they could manage. And here's this fly-by-night of this private company going to America and got their fingers in the pie at Ceylon and in Hong Kong as well. So if we look at this map of the world, by the end of 1946-47, ANA were wholly responsible for that operation. Air Ceylon started in Colombo, and that's C-O-L-O-M-B-O. Just before
Auckland's wrong to do.
Auckland, is it?
Yeah.
CK. Yes, you're right. Done in a hurry. Thank you. But Air Ceylon had rights from London to Colombo. And Ivan Holliman of ANA looked at this and he said to himself, all we need to do is extend that a little bit, and we've got the route to Sydney. So if we give them a bit of a hand and buy a few shares in the company, we'll have a pretty good answer out of all this. And so Ivan Holliman put his staff into all key positions, not as staff members but advisors. So you had advisor engineering, advisor route transport, advisor maintenance, advisor this, advisor that. And so they really had a big say in how Air Ceylon got going. When Cathay Pacific was set up, it was a bit of a ragtag show to start with. Sorry, Brian. They were mixed up in
It
gun
was when
running.
I joined them too.
Initially they were mixed up in gun running and all sorts of funny things. And but I've only got one green line there, but the green lines went all over Southeast Asia. They flew wherever they could to satisfy any customer. But it was when they got to Singapore, they saw that the maintenance was being well handled by ANA as supervision. And so they said, well, listen, maybe they could help us. So Ivan Holliman hopped on an aeroplane and went to Hong Kong to talk to Cathay, and he sowed the seed of their development. And that was, he said things like, you've got your aircraft flying 500 hours a year. They've got to fly 4,000 hours, and you've got to get the staff to fly them. So Cathay Pacific went from a ragtag show to something that was pretty good, and of course ANA had a big finger in the pie. The federal government was having a cadenza at this stage, and you've heard of the two airline policy, haven't you? They said, look, we've got to shut this mob down. So they didn't allow Air Ceylon to fly to Sydney. Air Ceylon put in a couple of charters every now and then, but the charters had obstacles put in the way where quarantines were put on aircraft and people and health and all that sort of stuff. They made it difficult for them where they could. Now the first opportunity when BCPA got on its feet, ANA was taken out of that. And so ANA ended up coming down to its shell in Australia. Harry was mixed up in this to some degree because of his peculiar ways, and I say they're peculiar because he was a stickler for things being done correctly. He had been very much instrumental in the maintenance of the schedule of BCPA, and they sent him to USA to look after management at the other end. So he became their ANA's USA representative. I'm only assuming this, but as Air Ceylon developed, they had their terminal in London, and I think Harry was probably sent to London to look after ANA's interest as far as Air Ceylon was concerned. While he was there, he did a favour for Winston Churchill, who wanted to be transported somewhere in a hurry and couldn't arrange it under the circumstances that existed at the time. So Harry said, no worries, I'll arrange that for you. So he received a thank you note from Winston Churchill, and there it is, the thank you note. Well, while Harry was in America, he got this photo taken alongside of a cutout. And when he'd been in England for a while, probably 48, 49, something like that, I'm not exactly sure of the dates. 49, he came back to Western Australia. Family matters, so I understand what brought him home. So in retirement, he was a standout. He never lost the love of cars and motorbikes and aeroplanes. And that was one of his cars that he'd had shipped back from America. It was a showstopper in Perth. Do you ever remember seeing it, Bob? I remember seeing it. He lived in South Perth. And whenever that was in South Perth or in the city, people used to queue up to look at it. He was devastated when his son was killed in an accident at Shay Gap in 1970. He'd never really approved of his son flying. He'd accepted it, but only just. And there was a bitter blow. Harry O'Neill, who normally sits around about here, was a trainee draftsman in the PWD, engineering draftsman, with young Harry in their early days. Harry's world slowed down considerably when he suffered a massive stroke in 1977, and he passed away in 1986.